Chapter 30. Meeting. Once Kevin was finished with Jay's leg, he went back to his computer and frowned. Jay sat up, fixing her armor back into place. "What's up, Kev?" she asked, standing and bending her knee, shaking out her leg to test the new wiring.
Odd readings, if I didn't know better."
He trailed off, still frowning.
"What?" "If I didn't know better, I'd say there was another Omnitrix."
Jay was by his side in an instant, one hand on the watch on her wrist.
"That's not possible. The mechanic only made one,"
Jay insisted. Kevin nodded.
"Yeah, I know, but look at the reading."
Jay glanced through the readings.
"It's almost exact." "Almost. A cheap knockoff, maybe?"
Kevin frowned.
"It's too close to yours for that, and look."
He pointed in the lines of code.
"That's his signature, isn't it?"
Jay looked a bit closer and nodded.
"It is, but that shouldn't be possible. Where is it?"
Kevin punched up the signal on a map and pulled a face.
"That's the rust bucket."
Jay's eyes narrowed and she slapped down the dial on the Omnitrix. She morphed, her armor changing with her. The resulting alien was clad in gray armor that form-fit to a Kinesillaran.
"Not for long."
She raced off before Kevin could say anything. He grabbed his hoverboard and pulled on his helmet, hiding his face from view as he chased after her. Jen frowned as she went through the photos of Tetrax's protégés. Something about the collection of aliens was odd. A Pyronite, a Vulpomancer, a Kinesillaran, a Petrosapian, a Galvan, a Tetramand, a Lepidopteran, a Pisceus Valan, a Galvanic Mechamorph, and an Ectoneurite. She blinked, scrolling back through them. She laughed as she recognized the connection. Maxwell blinked at her. "It's the original 10. Tetrax didn't have multiple protégés. One boy, one girl. No idea who the boy is. Could be anyone, really. But before she could elaborate, there was a rush of air and she was outside. Luckily, she was a quick thinker and dropped flat to the ground, spinning and slapping the Omnitrix as she went. The attacking alien slipped in goop and went flying into the tree. She slammed into it quite hard, and the tree shook on impact. Maxwell came bursting out of the trailer, a plumber rifle in hand. "I got this," Jen assured him as goop coalesced back into a humanoid shape. The Kinesillaran was back on her feet, her face covered with a visor. Her armor was gray and unadorned, though one spot was raised slightly, a perfect circle in the center of her chest. Jen rolled her eyes, or would have if Goop had the ability. She would need a bit more muscle to handle this, though, so she slapped the Omnitrix symbol, transforming seamlessly from Goop to forearms. She slammed her fists into the ground, sending the Kinesillaran flying. "You want to fight or you want to listen? Because I came here to talk." The Kinesillaran didn't respond, instead leaping to her feet and racing around again. Jen actually did roll her eyes this time. "Oh, great. Still in our stubborn phase in this universe, are we?" That brought the Kinesillaran to a screeching halt.
"Who are you?"
The voice was modulated slightly, but she had piqued their curiosity. Jen grinned, slapping a hand to the Omnitrix symbol on her sleeve, transforming back into herself. "Oh, I'm pretty sure you know. I'm you, after all." From the doorway of Maxwell's RV, there was a loud clatter as the gun fell from his hands.
"Jaybird."
His voice was shaking. The Kinesillaran flashed blue, shifting into a more human form, still dressed in the gray armor, helmet and all. The faceplate was opaque, and the girl hesitated as another armored figure landed. He seemed to realize quite quickly what was happening. He looked both girls over and blinked in confusion, but hesitated to strike. She reached up and pulled off her helmet. It was sort of like looking in a funhouse mirror, where Jen was quite sure that the image was her, but it was so twisted as to be almost unrecognizable. This face had a large scar running down her cheek. From just under her left eye, it curved in towards her mouth and stopped at her chin. Her hair was wild, parts braided with multicolored beads. She could make out tadenite, several different kinds of metal, including gold and brass, and what appeared to be ice. How it wasn't melting was a bit of a mystery, but Maxwell confirmed it. He rushed forward and pulled his granddaughter into his arms. The male glanced over at Jen and reached up, pulling off his own helmet. Jen blinked. Kevin! He frowned, but nodded.
Do I know you?
Jen laughed. I mean, there's a Kevin back in my universe, and I know him, so technically no. He blinked at her, looking beyond confused. Then he shrugged.
You know, if there's one thing I've learned running with Jay all these years, it's never question a Tennyson. They got weird shit happening, but they know how to deal with it.
Jay laughed loudly, and the two glanced over at where Maxwell was still holding his granddaughter. Jay was hiding her face in her grandfather's shoulder, but if the shaking of her shoulders was anything to go by, she had burst into tears. Jen turned to Kevin to give them some time. So, you and Jay, how did that happen? Kevin nodded, clearly understanding that his partner needed a minute to compose herself.
A bit of a long story. She and Tetrax picked me up out of a corrupted plumber prison.
Jen turned thoughtful. Wouldn't have been in Karsakon, would it?
Yeah, actually. The guy running it was having the prisoners
mind drugs.
How did you know that?
Kevin asked, a bit shocked. It happened in my universe, too. Later in the timeline, if you two met when you were first in Karsakon, and my version of Tetrax never got involved, he was too busy setting Petropia back up. That drew the attention of Jay. She scrubbed her face.
You still have Petropia?
Jen turned to her counterpart. Sort of. I revitalized it. The crystal Vilgax used to break it in the first place, it's a source code for the planet and its people. Jay's eyes went wide. Which alien did you use? Diamond Head? She demanded. Jen shook her head. No, you need chromostone. She held up her Omnitrix. Jay held up her own wrist, and Jen smiled to see the clunky original version of the watch. I have an idea, but if it works, you need to help me get home. Jane narrowed her eyes.
How?
Well, 2 heads are better than 1, and 2 gray matters might be able to fix the transdimensional engine that got me stuck here in the first place. Jay nodded.
Deal. What's your idea?
Jen tapped her Omnitrix to Jay's, and both devices whirred. The familiar voice of the Omnitrix echoed around the 2 teens. Sync complete. Jay flipped the dial on her Omnitrix and blinked.
There's like 70 aliens here.
Jen nodded. Yeah, in that ballpark. You never got past the original 10 because you didn't go through everything I did. Though you might have some I didn't. She shrugged. Honestly, I'm starting to lose track of how many I have. But my advice, don't use Alien X unless the universe is going to end. Pain in the ass, that one. Jay nodded.
Sort of how I can't use Ghost Freak anymore.
Jen shook her head. Not exactly, and you could call Grandma Verdona for that. She'll be able to fix that. Maxwell went pink in the cheeks. You've met your grandmother. Jen nodded, grinning at him. Yep, and she's really more interested in Gwen. I didn't get the spark she's interested in. You may want to check on that. Jen turned to Jay, and I think it's time you went home. Jay looked hesitant, but Jen forestalled any arguments her counterpart could make. Go home! I know you want to. I've been in similar shoes, and all I wanted the whole time I was gone was a hug from my parents. Go home! Jay nodded, hugging Maxwell again.
Kev, will you come with me?
Jay asked, her voice only shaking slightly. He took her hand and smiled.
Anywhere.
Jen pulled a face. It was weird. This Kevin had longer hair, blue eyes instead of her universe's near black-brown. He, too, had several visible facial scars. But they were smaller than Jay's, one running across his top lip, another through his left eyebrow, a third across the bridge of his nose. They looked at each other for a moment. for just a moment too long, and Jen had to hold back the slightly disgusted comment that Kevin was with Gwen. It was likely that this Kevin hadn't even met her cousin. Things here were different. And she kept that in mind as she waited in the back of Maxwell's car as Jay went up to the door of her family home. Maxwell turned to her, frowning slightly.
You're sure you don't want to be here for this? I mean, I'm pretty sure she's only going back because you knocked some sense into her.
Jen shook her head as Jay knocked on the front door. I didn't knock sense into her, I talked it. It often takes a Tennyson to get through to a Tennyson. And a wise woman once said to me that I'm the only person I reliably listen to. Maxwell laughed lightly.
Who told you that?
Gwen. We're pretty close where I'm from. A team. Well, we were. She's off at college now.
Our Gwen turned down graduating early.
That doesn't sound like my cousin.
She took Jay's disappearance hard. Last thing they did before she vanished was fight. They argued about the watch. Gwen didn't think Jay was responsible enough for it.
Jen shrugged. At that age, I really wasn't. I learned to be. Jay just learned a different way. A harder way by the looks of it. Jen glanced over at the doorway. Jay, her mother and father were in the doorway holding each other. Jen smiled and leaned forward. Tell her to meet me at this address. She pulled a pen out of her pocket and scrawled the address of the Mr. Smoothies on Maxwell's hand. He nodded, and Jen spun her Omnitrix to Big Chill. She transformed and flew through the roof, off to the Mr. Smoothies. Maybe she had pushed her counterpart to go home, but this wasn't her moment. Her family was back in her Bellwood, and honestly, all she wanted was to be home right now, hanging out with Rook, then heading home for dinner. She frowned as she phased through the roof of the smoothie shop. She still hadn't introduced Rook to her parents. She'd have to do that when she got home. She grinned slightly at the prospect her parents were going to love her partner almost as much as she did. She blinked and almost tripped as she transformed back into herself. Where the hell had that come from? She shook her head, a slip of the mental tongue, right? She wasn't in love with her partner. Her work partner. She couldn't be. Could she?